I offer a tribute to legendary game designer James Ward, who passed away on March 18th, 2024, today on Daddy Rolled a One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. And today I'm offering a tribute to game designer and author James Ward, who just passed away a couple days ago. Today's Tuesday, March 20th, and I'm sorry, it's Wednesday, March 20th, and he passed away on Monday, the 18th. So James, I know, had been sick for a while. He'd had some neurological issues that he was getting help with. And I know people like Tim Kask, a former TSR employee as well, who had worked with James quite a bit, had started some GoFundMe campaigns to help with his medical bills. But again, unfortunately, James did just pass away, and pretty young too. He was only 72, which in today's world, I feel like is not very old. Was born in 1951 in May, and this is the second, big TSR kind of luminary who's passed away just within the past few months. So some of you may have seen my tribute to Janelle Jakeways. She passed away almost exactly 2 months ago, back in January of 2024. So I did want to talk a little bit about James, and it is kind of interesting that when I have done my videos recently on Metamorphosis Alpha and Gamma World, I mentioned that we should do like a fuller deep dive on James, and unfortunately that came too late to do it while he was still with us. But in any event, I did want to talk just briefly. Now, I did give some information about James in that video. I don't want to retread too much, but the gist of it is that James discovered role-playing games actually through meeting Gary Gygax at a bookstore that they both shopped at coincidentally. And James would go on the day each week when the new books hit the shelves, and he was specifically looking for fantasy, swords and sorcery, and science fiction books. And the story that James tells is that he was at the store, he had a stack of books, and he happened to catch someone out of the corner of his eye. And when he looked, that person was had a stack of basically the same books that James had, and that person was Gary Gygax. They began a conversation, and Gary invited James to come hang out and learn about this new game where you could play. I believe that was Gary said you can play a game where you can play Conan in the game, and James was intrigued by that, and so began a friendship with Gary that then later translated to James being one of the first people that was hired at TSR. The number I've seen was that he was the 5th employee. So we know Tim Kask was the first. So at any event, James was very, very early employee. And again, I don't want to go over too much of things that I've gone over before to retread, but just to kind of talk about some of the history and really the legacy of the game design development that he left with us. So he is responsible for creating this game, Metamorphosis Alpha. Now, this is it's definitely the first science fantasy role-playing game. And some people say first science fiction. We talked about that before, and you can quibble about semantics on that, but there was another game that actually preceded this that would technically qualify as the first science fiction game. And but Metamorphosis Alpha, first science fantasy game, and this came about because as Jim was playing through dungeons with Gary Gygax, he said, we should do a game like D&D, but for science fiction, like a science fiction setting. And Gary said, great, why don't you write it? And that's essentially how James got his first writing gig for TSR, his first design gig. And he looked at it as designing a dungeon in space, or essentially that's why it takes place on a spaceship. So it's trying to replicate what were the main themes of Dungeons and Dragons, which is that you're in this, fixed space, and you're going to explore it. And so James just took that fixed space and put it on a derelict spaceship that's floating in outer space. But essentially, it's the same concept. So that was this. And again, as we talked about in that video, and there's links up here so you can check this out. But then eventually there's a revision. It's not really a revision of this game. Some people say this is the sequel. I don't really think of it that way because the themes are very, very different. Mechanically, they're very, very similar. So I think, you could say that's a sequel. But in any event, Gamma World, first post-apocalyptic role-playing game, 1978. Again, using a lot of the same mechanics. And then, of course, Gamma World second edition. And it continued on. It's just I only have the first and second editions. The third edition changed the mechanics very drastically to use the action control table. Fourth edition came back, and fourth edition Gamma World came back to using mechanics that were similar to second edition D&D. And then it goes on and on from there up to, I want to say, a seventh edition. I'm pretty sure seventh was the last one, which was published by Wizards of the Coast and actually used some very unique card-based mechanics, but some of the mechanics were also based on the current version of D&D at the time, which was fourth edition. So anyway, long history of science fiction, science fantasy, post-apocalyptic role-playing games. James did work on other Metamorphosis Alpha editions after TSR. So one of the unique things, and again, we talked about this in that video, James was able to retain the rights to Metamorphosis Alpha. So unlike Gamma World, which the rights are owned by now Wizards of the Coast because they were property of TSR, and Wizards acquired all of TSR's properties. Whether they're doing something with them or not is a whole other story. But James controlled the rights to Metamorphosis Alpha. And so he was able to publish other editions of the game published by other people, whether it was himself or, working with other people. And so that's actually kind of cool because he was able to explore this in the future, although it stays very, very faithful to the original. And James has kind of basically said, I heard an interview with him on a podcast where, and I'm paraphrasing, this isn't his exact words, but basically his point was the mechanics work great. Why would you change them? There's no reason to change them. So you can hear more about, the mechanics and stuff of Metamorphosis Alpha, and my thoughts on those again in that other video that's about Gamma World and the post-apocalyptic games. Okay, and that's 1976. That's Metamorphosis Alpha. So something else that he wrote in 1976 is this booklet. This is Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. Now, we haven't talked about this one too much. I've spent more time on Greyhawk, Blackmore, and a little bit on the Eldritch Wizardry supplements in terms of the mechanics and just the concepts that they added to the game, particularly the new classes. And there's a whole series on the classes. But this was the last supplement for D&D. Now, again, I just talked about this in another video, but some people will say Swords and Spells was the last supplement for D&D. Swords and Spells is a companion to D&D, but it's essentially war game rules. It's not creating rules that would be used in a standard D&D campaign. This one technically isn't either, but in any event, TSR themselves said that this was the last supplement, and we can see that on the inside here when we get to the foreword, and Tim Cass says, well, here it is, the last D&D supplement. So he tells you, this is it. This is the last one. So this is why I consider this to be the last supplement. But in any event, this is written by Rob Kuntz and Jim Ward. And the story that Jim tells, there's not a lot of history that I can find about why this specific book was published and why it was considered the last supplement for D&D. But it is interesting when you think about when we look at the different versions of D&D throughout the years, and specifically if you look at first edition, second edition, and third edition. Those would be the three that I think kind of encapsulate this thought that I have, which is that, when you look at original D&D and you have your books from the original set here, you have Men in Magic, which is your player's handbook, essentially. You have Monsters and Treasure, which is, that's your monster manual and half of your DMG. And then you have Underworld and Wilderness Adventure. That's your DMG. So those are your three core books that started as the three books in original D&D. This is the fourth one. So when you look at advanced D&D, you have the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. Monster Manual is published first. 77, Monster Manual, Player's Handbook, 78, and Dungeon Master's Guide, 79. The fourth hardback book that was published for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, Deities and Demigods, written by James Ward. Okay, and that was because he worked on this book. So there was this thought that, having information on deities and pantheons was core to the experience of playing Dungeons and Dragons. So he works on this book, and he talks about how Jim Ward, that is, talks about how, like, there was no internet. So he was at the library, he's checking out books, he's reading all these books. And he specifically says every book that he mentions in this book, and in particular in this one where he says, like, I got this information from whatever this book was, he read that book. It wasn't just like he read about it. He actually read the book. So did a lot of research, and he talks a lot about how, there was no internet, so it took a really long time. He has a family. By the time he's working at TSR in 1976, he's already married, young, and he's got kids. And so he's working on writing this stuff basically in his sort of spare time because he has a full-time job. So, so he works on this, and it, very typical of James Ward's design. And I don't, it's not a criticism. It's just, you see this in his work a lot, especially his early work. So you have this foreword here by Tim Kask, who's editing this book, talking about what's in here. And a little bit about how, like, getting rid of the idea that you can play a 44th level Lord, because that's ridiculous. Nobody could ever be that high in level. And Odin, the Allfather, only, in question mark, only has 300 hit points. Anyway, but then right after that, what do you get? There's no introduction. Why do you have this book? What will you use it for? How do you use the book? Nope. Just starts out, do gods have psionic abilities? And here's how you determine it. That it's just, again, very common of James' work. A lot of times he doesn't take any time to explain why you're using this book or why you might want to use it. He just starts talking about stuff. There's no organization in this, really. There's no table of contents. Okay. There's no index. So you don't know what's where. You just jump in, and he explains, okay, here's how you determine if your gods have psionic ability. And then he just jumps into the Egyptian mythology and gives you this little paragraph here to explain it. And then you have all of these statistics here. He doesn't explain, like, what all this stuff means. If you don't have Eldritch Wizardry, you have no idea what Psionic Ability Class 6 is. So that's where Psionic's debut is, in Eldritch Wizardry. He doesn't tell you to refer to Eldritch Wizardry. The assumption was you would just have it and know how to use all these tables with psionic abilities. So again, very early in terms of game design and layout, and also just functionality of these types of books. But he describes all these things, and basically just what you get is armor class, their movement rate. I don't know why you need to know the movement rate, but he gives you the movement rate for the gods, their hit points, whether they have magic ability, their fighting ability, and then their psionic ability, and then a short little description. Okay, so there's your Egyptian pantheon, and then he goes through. Now, what's interesting here is that you have gods of India, and this one has no introduction. It's just gods of India, and then he just jumps in. So it's the only pantheon in the book that doesn't get at least a blurb telling you what it's about. So he goes through the gods of India, and then he gets to Greek mythology. He talks a little bit about that and says they're probably more familiar to you. Okay. But at least there's a little bit of an introduction there. So Greek, and, I'm not reading all these. I'm just talking about, like, this is one of James Ward's main legacies in Dungeons and Dragons, is developing these pantheons, which then, are used as a model or a pattern for how the deities of, say, Greyhawk were presented, how the deities of the Forgotten Realms were presented in terms of figuring out what people need to know about them. It all goes back to this original book. Now, of course, it's been expanded on and changed, but James was the first one to kind of, I guess, realize, working with Rob Kuntz, that players would need to know this, especially cleric players, but like that it was important to develop pantheons for a campaign setting. So he talks about the Celtic mythos, and they get a whole paragraph of introduction here. Okay, so there's your Celtic, the fun little design there. And after Celtic, and there's a lot in here. So now we're into Norse. Okay, and so I guess this is the other one. I forgot. There is no introduction to Norse. It's just an asterisk after the movement distance indicates other forms of locomotion are possible. So that is the other pantheon that doesn't get an introduction. Okay, so there's your Norse gods. It's quite long. And it covers giants and all kinds of things. So there are monsters, and there's also artifacts and equipment, weapons and things like that in here. Okay, and then final notes on your Norse mythology. Then he goes into the Finnish gods, and he talks a little bit about why he included it. Okay, as we know, Gary Gygax quotes from Finnish mythology. He doesn't quote from it. He references Finnish mythology, especially the I forget the name, the Kalevala, something like that. But it's like a book of Finnish mythology, and he references that book when he talks about that was a consideration for how they would build the D&D magic system, was using that system of magic that was presented in those Finnish stories. So apparently that Gary was aware enough of this, and then James delved into it. So, I'd never heard of Finnish mythology until I got this book in the 80s. But, even early on in 1976, they're referencing Finnish mythology here. So he talks a little bit about that here. And then you get into... Sorry, my eyes aren't great, so sometimes I have to hold the book a little closer to see what I'm looking at here. Okay. Oh, then he covers the mythology of Robert E. Howard's Hyboria. And then he says the Conan's world is very real, and that Robert E. Howard went to great lengths to limit his magic and sorcery to firm up the believability of his stories. The gods of this world are of many types and go from one extreme to the next in working or leaving alone mankind. So, this is going to be the start of a precedence of, well, it's not even the start, but TSR was very big on let's adapt existing fictional content to D&D. As you saw in the beginning here, there's no trademark stuff. There's no with permission of, they just put it in here. Okay, but this is actually kind of cool. So this is the only place that you're going to see these Conan deities and stuff in a D&D setting early on. Later on, TSR actually publishes a Conan role-playing game, but this is, years before that, at least a decade. Okay, so he goes through this, and then you also have Elric and the Melnibone stories. Okay, once again, no introduction. So I keep saying India was the only one, but now we've seen Norse and Melnibone don't have introductions. But still, again, these are written from assumptions that people know what you're already talking about. So, at the time when this came out, I had never read these stories. I didn't have any idea who these people were. I didn't know what this was. So I think it's interesting that again, it's this common language of gamers back then. The community was very small. It was way smaller than we can even imagine right now. This is only 2 years after the game has come out. And while there are people playing in California, we know that they were starting to get people playing in the United Kingdom, and so they were, developing relations over there to have people distribute their games. But for the most part, I think the core playing group were people that either played with Dave or Gary in the, Midwest, in the Lake Geneva area, or with Dave's group in Minneapolis and, or, Twin Cities area. And they had, so there was this kind of common understanding among them that, you don't need to explain what this is because everybody's going to know. Okay. So that's your, Melnibone ones. And then he comes back over here to talk about, he gets out of the fictional ones and he goes into Mexican and Central American Indian mythology. So he comes back to real world Earth mythology. And then he covers Eastern mythos. This is really pretty much from China. So he covers that. And then there's some nice art here. Now, there's no art credits in this particular book. This one is signed, so we know that who did this one. Okay, but the cover, this cover design is not credited to anybody, unfortunately. Okay, so that's Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. So later on, after this was published, Advanced D&D, this is 1976 again, same year as Metamorphosis Alpha. So Gary Gygax starts working on Advanced D&D, and then you have the Eric J. Holmes version of Basic that comes out in 1977. Anyway, James eventually is going to write this book for Advanced D&D, Deities and Demigods. So I have 2 different copies here. You can see the cover is a little different. Now, I did talk about this in my video on the history of Advanced D&D hardbacks. There's a link up here to check that out. This is the one I got first. This is the one that my mom gave me, and she wrote my name on the inside because I took it to school with me, so I don't write that nice. But this is the later printing. So this is, I want to say, this 4th printing. And I think a lot of people know the history of this, but just really quickly, James worked on this one first. So this one is a second printing, and I know it's a second printing because he said there is. Oh yeah, I always forget where the note is. There is a note of thanks in here. It's down here. Special thanks are also given to Chaosium for permission to use the material found in the Cthulhu mythos and the Melnibonéan mythos. So. And those mythos are in this book. And so that means that this is a second printing. The 3rd printing has that special note of thanks, but the Cthulhu and Melnibonéan mythos have been excised from the book. And then the 4th printing and on, like this one, does not have the note of thanks, and it doesn't have the mythos. So 4 different printings pretty quickly. But the short version is that Gary and James talked, and Gary wanted to put the Cthulhu mythos in the book, or James did, and Gary agreed. Whatever the case is, they had discussed it, and they discussed that they were only going to use, even though at this point in time, the Cthulhu mythos was sort of open, where people could other authors could add their interpretation and add to the stories. Like August Derleth had written some books and things like that. He wasn't the only one, and but James decided to only use works by Lovecraft to put into this Cthulhu mythos section. But he did that. So he puts, you've got Cthulhu in here, and you've got Deep Ones, and you've got the Great Race and Hastur the Unspeakable. So he puts all of these in here. Now, when he's doing this, he realizes at this point we've gone beyond this, where we're just going to throw stuff in here and hope that it works. That no one's going to get us in trouble, like putting the Conan deities and stuff in here. So he secures permission from people who owned rights to Cthulhu and then Michael Moorcock's Melnibonéan deities, which are in here as well. So, not to get too deep into the weeds on this, but essentially what happens is James secures rights to use the deities from those stories and some of the monsters and maybe even some equipment or, weapons, whatever, in this book. Now, this is a game, but it's a book. Okay, so terminology gets weird because later on, this is published first in 1980. By 1981, Chaosium has secured the rights to publish games using the Cthulhu mythos or the Cthulhu stories, and also Michael Moorcock's Melnibonéan stories. Okay, and so they had, the rights to use those, but TSR did as well in a different manner. And I think that the confusion came about was because at that time, people didn't really understand that games could be books. This is what I've read, at least. And so the people that gave the rights to TSR didn't understand that it was a game. And so they didn't realize that they'd given their rights to 2 different game companies for essentially the same thing. That's one version that I read. For whatever the case may be, again, it's legal semantics on how this happened. But Chaosium ends up sending a cease and desist to TSR and says, you can't publish this. We have the rights to this. And that was within their rights to do that. This isn't Chaosium's fault. It's also not James Ward's fault. A lot of people think James just went off, half-cocked and just did this and do it first and ask for permission later. So according to James, he did have permission and he gave the signed documents to TSR's legal department. However, TSR at this point, it's only 4 years old, actually less than 4 because it started out in 70. TSR wasn't incorporated until, I guess it was about 5 years old, 1975. So, but still, it's a pretty fledgling company. And the lawyers at TSR, I guess, didn't want to quibble. They didn't want to fly to California, hire an attorney, and argue the case because, what if they lost? And also it was a lot of money to like even do that part of it. So they chose to put the special thanks in here in the beginning, like I showed you earlier, to credit Chaosium for giving them permission to use those mythos in here. Now that could have been the end of the story. However, the powers that be at TSR in the time decided that this little thank you in here was tantamount to giving free publicity or free advertising to Chaosium, and they didn't want to do that. So starting with the third printing, they just removed those two whole sections of the book, the Cthulhu section, which goes through here. So they removed the Cthulhu section, and then they removed the Melnibonéan section here, and just reduced the book. And so James said, he offered that he would write two replacement mythos to put in the book. He's like, I got plenty of material. There's plenty of stuff out there. I can do this. And again, the powers that be at TSR said no. And so what they did was they just cut those pages out of the book and continued to publish it at the same price as the original. And, again, slight color change on the cover. You can see the different logos here. But anyway, that's one of the stories. Now, when I was a kid, I had this. Now, this isn't my original version. My original version is beat all to it's not in good shape. And I had this. And these were the first two times where I came across James Ward's name. And so I knew that he was an important person. And then I acquired these much later. And I got this during the early pandemic lockdowns by saving money, not going out to eat, not going to the pub, and not buying comics because there are no new comics being published. So I'd wanted the Cthulhu and Melnibonéan mythos version of this for a long time. So I just saved up money and went on eBay and found a copy. And it's in pretty good shape. I think my original is in better shape. This one looks like it's got maybe some water damage or something along here. And you saw there was some discoloration on the inside. But, for the most part, it's in good shape. And I'm very happy to have this. It's I loved reading those because I'd never had a chance to look at those before. James continues on at TSR even after Gary Gygax has left. Gary Gygax is he leaves the company in 1985. Essentially, he was probably going to be forced out anyway. And a lot of people said they forced him out. But he actually does leave of his own accord. But the writing was on the wall at that point. So there was really no point for him to stay, I guess, is what I'm saying. But so James kind of takes over sort of stewardship of the Greyhawk line because TSR still owed this, even though this owned it, even though this was Gary's creation. So James writes Greyhawk Adventures. So this is the last book that was published for the advanced D&D line for first edition. And you see, even when it was published, it says compatible with AD&D and second edition AD&D game systems. So this is that kind of like a transition book. There's really nothing in here that's second edition mechanically. But just to give you a sense again of the James Ward kind of design mentality. So you've got this table of contents here. So he's got a dedication, very nice. And then he just jumps in and goes, okay, here's your deities and clerics of Greyhawk. No explanation of what Greyhawk is, no history of it, nothing like that. So again, this book assumes that you have the World of Greyhawk box set and that you are familiar enough with Greyhawk. So we don't need any fancy kind of introduction or, explanation of the world or background or anything like that. We're just going to jump in and start talking with our deities and clerics of Greyhawk. And as you see this book, it's very interesting. So he does deities and clerics, then he does monsters, the Hall of Heroes, magical spells, magical items, geography. So this is like, when I think of a setting book, I think of like this stuff coming first, the geography, the history of the world. So there's no history in this at all. It just does geography, talks about doing adventures. And then he does an appendix on running 0-level characters and then a Greyhawk spell list. Now, the reason that these topics are covered in this book is because James actually put, and I think it was in Dragon Magazine, he wrote an article where he basically said, like, tell me what you want to see in this book. Like, I'm writing this book. And so he based the contents of this on fan requests for what was going to be included. So And I think that's great. That it's very, it's market research, but he's giving people what they want. And James was kind of, he was good at that. He was good at understanding, like, listening to the consumer and understanding like what it was that they wanted to see. I think his organization could use a little help, but that's just me. Like I said, I have a preconceived notion of what a campaign setting book should be like. And if you look at the Dragonlance book and then look at Greyhawk, the Dragonlance book is set up very, very different. All right. So just finishing up with a few more things that James Ward worked on. So I forgot to mention this when I went through the Deities and Demigods, but at the end here, there's this discussion on planes, and we did talk about this before in my video on the history of planes and alignment in D&D. But if you see this section here on the concordant opposition, so James said that he had to create that in order to make the planes and alignment stuff work with the work that Gary Gygax had done early on in Strategic Review, and then later when he worked on the Player's Handbook for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So I guess we can credit James Ward for the concordant opposition. So James, like I said, ends up staying with TSR for quite a while. So this is a fun article that he wrote. This is Dragon Magazine number 154. And so this is right as second edition is coming out. This is February of 1990. So second edition came out in 1989. But a lot of people were unhappy with some stuff that had happened. And so James wrote an article to kind of explain some of the decisions that he makes, and he calls it the Angry Mothers from Heck, or Angry Mothers Syndrome, and basically says that's why they took Demons and Devils out of the Monster Manual. And he goes on to say that like he was getting at least 1 to 2 letters a week about of complaints for people who objected to the mention of demons and devils in that game book. And so he just decided the easiest thing to do was just get rid of them, take them out, and then they'll stop getting the complaint letters. So, it's what's interesting is, so he's telling you, like, basically, yeah, we did this to please a small group of people that were complaining all the time because they didn't want complaints. They wanted everyone to play these games, as evidenced by the fact that later on, James actually works with Rose Estes at TSR on a sort of education program from TSR to work on writing adventures that would help educators in schools. So he was really big on that. And what's really fun and, a testament to James is that, so a few issues after this, I think it's issue number 156, people had written in response to his article in here about removing demons and devils. And to his credit, he actually printed them. And a lot of them were not very kind about the decisions that he'd made, but he wanted people's voices to be heard. And so he published those letters. So, he writes fiction for TSR and for others, but, in the TSR days, he wrote the fictional, novels, novelizations of the Pool of Radiance video games, take place in the Forgotten Realms. So he worked on those and then, wrote some more fiction. He wrote an episode of the G.I. Joe animated cartoon back in the 80s. I think it was in the 80s. And so, had his hands in a lot of different things. So works at TSR all the way up through the Lorraine Williams era. And he was a pretty high level executive, I think VP in charge of creative services or something like that. And he's tasked with the job of getting rid of a bunch of people, basically at the point where TSR is like a lot of mismanagement with the money. There's other books and blogs out there that deal with this kind of thing. But the thing is, they were making all these sales, but the sales wasn't translating to revenue because they had a lot of unpaid bills, and it was a real problem. And so they needed to, cut. One of the biggest expenses to cut is staff. And so they Lorraine tasked James with cutting a bunch of people in the creative development department. And the way James said is kind of like, that's the lifeblood of this organization. If you cut the creative people, we don't have any product to sell. And so rather than go through the the effort of cutting away these people in sort of a form of protest, I guess James actually quit. So he left the company rather than fire those people. Now they're going to get let go anyway. I'm sure James knew that, but he was making a statement like, this is not the company that I want to work at anymore. So he left TSR. And he does end up working, he stays working in the game industry for a while, started his own company for a little bit during the D20 era, Fast Forward Entertainment. And then he worked a lot with the Troll Lord Games folks on different things. So that's really going to kind of wrap up our look at James Ward. One last thing I want to mention that he did, and this is going way back in time, in 1980, I think it was the October issue of Dragon Magazine, number 42, he writes a really kind of fun adventure, The Mansion of Mad Professor Ludlow, something like that. Sorry, I don't remember the name right off the top of my head. And I unfortunately don't own that issue as a physical copy. But if you can get your hands on that adventure, it's kind of fun because it's an early look at an idea of like a modern day group of people that end up, in a D&D scenario. So it's like a bunch of campers, sort of like, Boy Scouts or whatever, that are on a camping trip, and shenanigans happen. And it's definitely a fun adventure that you should check out. So again, just a really wanted to look at this legacy that James Ward left with us. I've mentioned before that Gamma World was the second role-playing game I ever played after D&D. And I really took to this game quite a bit back in the day. So, it's very sad that James has passed away, and especially that he wasn't well toward the end of his life. I know he was still active on social media, so I would see comments from him on different Facebook groups that I belonged to about gaming. So he was still staying involved and commenting and things like that. So I'm glad for that. I'm glad that he was able to contribute and share his stories. He'd been interviewed quite a bit in the recent years on different podcasts and blogs and things like that. So we were able to get some knowledge from him before he passed away. But yet another luminary from the early days of the role-playing game industry is gone. And so I wanted to do a tribute to him. So please leave in the comments what your favorite memories are of James. And I'm sure a lot of you actually might have met him at different conventions. And, or, if not, just, some favorite games or adventures or maybe books, if you're into his fiction that he wrote. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments on your memories of James Ward. And with that, I'm just going to wrap it up by saying thank you very, very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I'll talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content. So kind of like with my video with Janelle Jaquays, I did consider maybe not doing bonus content, but I wanted to, rather than, be, sad, I kind of want to celebrate James's life. And so I thought I would pick up this bottle that I have here. This is HUDSON Double Charred Whiskey. Sorry, it's not staying in focus there. And this is from New York. So from Tuttletown Spirits and Gardner. I think it's Tuthilltown. I don't know how to pronounce that. Sorry, guys. I'm going to start opening it. I've never opened this before. I only have one bottle. But so the story of this is that this distillery has been in this area for over 200 years. And it was, or it wasn't a distillery. I think, there's other stuff there. But a person acquired it around 2001. And went and bought a still online, or, however you buy it, and didn't really have any instructions and just kind of wanted to figure out how to make stuff. And so started out making vodka, and then went on to start trying to make some whiskey, as whiskey was getting to be more popular. And so wanted to kind of, capitalize on that. And so learned how to make whiskey, and HUDSON whiskey is pretty popular. I've had it before. And then what happened was, sadly, in 2012, some vapors coming out of one of the stills that they had, caught fire, exploded. And the distillery caught fire. And while their equipment mostly escaped, the they had some barrels there that got burned so badly that all of the markings on the barrels were destroyed. And so they actually didn't know exactly what was in the barrels, like which barrel was which, like which, whatever. And but they were able, the contents were still okay. They just didn't have all the details of what was in it. But they decided to go ahead and keep it and bottle those. And so they bottled it as this. It's called double charred whiskey, and it's because the barrel actually was essentially almost burned on the outside. So, and then, so very, very limited quantities of this. As you can see, it's a small bottle, and I have never opened it. So basically, they kept it in the barrels for another 2 years, and then they bottled it in 2014. And I just took the cork off, but I'll show you that in a second. So they bottled it in 2014. So 10 years. So I've had this for 10 years, or roughly thereabouts, and never opened it. It's hard to see, but year, that's a 4. So batch 1. And I thought now was a perfect time to finally break this open. Like I used to buy things and save them for a special occasion. As I've been getting older, I've realized like there's going to be fewer and fewer of those special occasions. And why am I saving this stuff? But this was an opportunity to toast to James and say thanks. And so I thought I would do that with this very special whiskey that I bought. And guess I'm kind of sharing it with you. I wish I could do so in person, but we'll do the best that we can. So to James. Mm. Wow, a lot of rye spice. There's definitely some caramely sweetness, but you sort of on the back you get kind of that a little bit of smokiness. It's not as smoky as I was expecting. Definitely leans heavier into that kind of rye spice, which is something I really enjoy. So that's really nice. I'm glad I opened that. Then as far as listening, this is Blossom DEARIE, self-titled album. So this originally came out in 1957. And okay, so if you are of my age or thereabouts, and if YouTube statistics are correct, I think the vast majority of you are within 10 years front or back of my age range. You probably grew up with Schoolhouse Rock. Okay, so if you've heard Schoolhouse Rock and you know the song Figure 8, that's the classic one that she sings, but that's Blossom DEARIE sing. So anytime you see a girl or hear a girl singing in Schoolhouse Rock, I think it's every time it's a girl or a female voice. That's Blossom DEARIE. The male voice has kind of changed around. There was a few different guys that did that. But anyway, she was a jazz singer before that, famous jazz singer. And that is just how her voice sounds. She has this very kind of high-pitched, very almost girlish voice. She didn't have the deep voice of like a Sarah Vaughan or an Ella Fitzgerald or anything like that. But anyway, this was her, I believe, debut album. And the reason I picked it, it's very relaxing. And it's just the kind of mood that I was in while I was working on my notes for this video. But also today is March 21st, and the first day of spring was yesterday, and which is when I started recording the video. I had to do it in 2 different days, but it might as well be spring, classic, American songbook song, and a fine spring morning were on this album. And I just kind of thought it was appropriate, for the time of when I was recording this. Spring's a time of renewal. And I had that in mind as I was thinking about the passing of James. So it will be a very different listening experience. I tend to listen to more instrumental jazz than vocal jazz, but I do like vocal jazz, unlike a lot of folks who just won't even listen to it. But if you're looking for something relaxing, maybe it's cocktail hour. And if you don't do cocktail hour, give it a shot. Bring it back. Try it at your house. You're making dinner. Put on a record. If you don't have a vinyl, put it on your Spotify or whatever you want, and make a drink, And if it doesn't have to be alcoholic, just, but put effort into it. Don't just pour something out of a bottle. Like, make something that you're going to spend time on and kind of think about and contemplate over. And, it could be a mocktail or, whatever, it could be tea. It could be, maybe you like a pour over coffee, whatever it is. And, just take a moment to kind of reflect on the changing of the seasons and, maybe think about some people that we've lost in our lives. And, you know, with that, I'd just like to offer another toast to our friend James. Condolences to his friends and family. Thanks for all of the games that you created that definitely have had a huge impact on my life. And traveling mercies to you.